Mission to Tokyo. If there was any justice in this world, I would have been a dead man at least 2 times over. By this, I mean simply that many times in my life, the statistical probabilities of a fatal outcome have been overwhelming thanks to my sins of excess and poor judgment. My inability to say no to anything that sounded as if it might have been fun, but all rights I should have been, at various times shot to death, stabbed to death, imprisoned for a significant period of time, or at very least victimized by a cassava-sized tumor. I often use a hypothetical out-of-control ice cream truck. What would happen if you were walking across the street and were suddenly hit by a careening Mr. Softy truck as you lie there in your last few moments of consciousness? What kind of final regrets flash through your mind? I should have had a last cigarette. Might be one, or I should have dropped acid with everybody else back in '74. Maybe I should have done that hostess after all. Something along the lines of I should have had more fun in my life. I should have relaxed a little more, enjoyed myself a little more. That was never my problem. When they're yanking a fender out of my chest cavity, I would decidedly not be regretting missed opportunities for a good time. My regrets will be more along the lines of a sad list of people hurt, people let down, assets wasted, and advantages squandered. I'm still here, and I'm surprised by that every day. So the spring of 1999, I really and truly thought I had all my great adventures. I really and truly thought that I had all my great adventures, that the entertainment and excitement segment of the program was long over. Been there and done that was more than an assumption for me. It was a defensive stance, and one that kept me and keeps me from repeating the stupid mistakes of the past. Sure, there were things to learn. I learned things all the time, but I'm talking about eye-opening, revelatory, perspective-altering life experiences, the exotic, the frightening, the totally new. I wasn't about to sample any new experimental hallucinogens at age 43. I wasn't going to submerge myself in some new criminal subculture, steeping myself in the customs and practices of professional gamblers, heroin seekers, or sexual adventurers, though at one time it would have greatly appealed to me. I didn't think I'd be shipping out on a great big clipper ship, as Lou Reed puts it, wandering the back streets of Peshawar, or sampling live monkey brain in the Golden Triangle. My personal journey, I thought, was pretty much over. I was comfortably ensconced in secure digs with a wife who still remarkably found me to be amusing on occasion. I had a job I loved in a successful restaurant. I was alive, for Christ's sakes. I was still around. Though the game had long since gone into overtime, I still had a few moves left in me, and I was content to play them out where I'd started. New York City, the place I believe heart and soul to be the center of the world, so it came as a surprise when one of the 2 partners of Le Hal, Felipe Lajani, a man I barely conversed with up to that time, approached me one spring afternoon and said, "Chef, we'd like you to go to Tokyo. Make the food look good, taste good like it does in New York." Now, Brasserie Le Hal is a much-loved New York institution, serving authentic French working man's fare to the hordes of dinners each night. I'm an American, whatever my lineage, so it threw me off guard to be asked if I care to go halfway around the world to consult and advise a French chef in Japan on the fine points of cassoulet, navarin diagno, frisée lardons, and boudin noir at Le Hal, Tokyo. But my masters Felipe, a Frenchman, Jose de Merili, a Portuguese Francophile, seemed convinced enough of my mystical connection to the food they clearly adored to pack me onto a plane and send me jetting off to Tokyo for a week. It was a daunting and unusual assignment. I was going alone. My wife would not be joining me. So I think he was born in, was Bourdain born in France? No, he was born here, but he went to France, right? Because he's French, so he has some sort of. It's crazy, man. They could have sent, but these are businessmen from America, right? But they like Bourdain's dedication. Like, he's not even from France. You think they could find a French chef, you know? But this guy, Bourdain, became good at what they wanted. And my biggest concern was the flight. 14 hours in the air and no smoking. I scored some Valium before leaving for the airport, thinking maybe I could knock myself out and sleep through the ordeal. Unfortunately, as my Israeli-navigated town car swung into the Kennedy Airport environs, I couldn't find the damn pills. I tore frantically through my pockets and carry-on luggage, near tears cursing myself, my wife, God, and everybody else who might be responsible for this hideous situation. I checked my knives through, not wanting to carry them on, and was soon dug in at 11 a.m. at the bar by the departure gate. Last stop for degenerate smokers. My companions were a very unhappy-looking bunch of Asia veterans. Like me, they were chain-smoking and drinking beer with grim, determined expressions on their faces. A Chinese gentleman next to me, a propros of nothing, shook his head, blew smoke out of his nose, and said, "Sleeping pill. Only thing to do was sleep. 14 hours to Narita. Long time." This did not improve my mood. Another bar customer, an MP, headed to South Korea to pick up a prisoner, An MP headed to South Korea to pick up a prisoner slammed back another draft and described the horror of business class to the other side of the world. He too shook his head, lips pursed, resigned to his fate. A red-faced Aussie with a 5-hour layover waiting for him on Tokyo End advised me to have another beer, at least. They're 3, mate. Nothing to do but bloody sleep. Yeah, right, I thought. Got any Demerol? As a backup, I had acquired a few nicotine patches. I rolled up my left sleeve and slapped one directly over a vein, hoping for the best as they sounded final boarding. The flight was endless. The in-flight movie was a slight improvement overlooking out the window, a Japanese film about, as best as I could gather, fly fishing. Guys standing around in waters, philosophizing about carpet and luggage I couldn't understand. In a language I couldn't understand. Had a pleasantly somnolent effect, and I managed with the help of many more beers to pass out for a few hours. I should point out, by the way, that I know nothing about Japan, or sure, I've seen the Seven Samurai and Rashomon and Yojimbo and Kurosawa Policiers and Sonny Chiba and Ghidorah versus Mecha Godzilla for that matter, but I was in every significant way ignorant of all things Japanese. I knew only enough about Japanese culture and history to know that I knew nothing. I spoke not a word of Japanese. I had, with only a week's warning before my trip, not even required a guidebook or a street map for the city of Tokyo. Not even acquired a guidebook. But I did like sushi and sashimi. The city of Tokyo is an amazing sprawl, something out of William Gibson or Philip Dick, seeming to go on forever. The bus from the airport wound over bridges, down through tunnels, up flyovers that wrapped around the upper floors of apartment and office buildings, that passed canals, industrial parks, factories, residential areas, business districts, carp ponds, austere temples, indoor ski slopes, rooftop driving ranges. As I got closer to my destination, it was getting dark, with giant screaming video screens advertising beverages and cell phones and recording artists. Garage signs in English and Japanese, lines of cars, crowds of people, row after row after row of them surging through intersections in orderly fashion. This was not America or any place remotely like it. Things on the other side of the world were very, very different. The bus unloaded at a hotel in Roppongi district, and a helpful dispatcher in a uniform held me a cab. The rear passenger door swung open for me, operated by the driver by lever, and I slid onto a clean white slip-covered back seat. Dispatcher and driver examined the Lahal business card with address, debating route and destination. When the matter was decided, the door swung closed and we were off. The driver wore white gloves. Roppongi district is international in character, like an Asian Georgetown, and Lahal, Tokyo, located in the shadow of the Eiffel-like Tokyo Tower and across the street from a pachinko parlor, looked much like its older brother in New York, though spanking new and impeccably surgically clean. Lahal, New York is loved for its smoke-stained walls, creaky chairs, weathered wooden bar, the fact that it resembles what it is. A familiar, worn, old-school brassiere of the Parisian model. Lahal, Tokyo, on the other hand, though accurate to the model down to the tiniest design detail, was shiny and undamaged and apparently kept that way. It was a warm night when I arrived, and the French doors of the cafe were open. Philip saw me from the bar. He had arrived a day earlier. He came out to greet me. "Welcome to Tokyo, chef," he said. I had been provided with an apartment nearby, and Philippe helped load my luggage on the handlebars of 2 borrowed bicycles for the short trip over. My first close-up look at Tokyo was from the seat of a rickety 3-car as I pedaled furiously to keep up with Philippe. He took off at a good pace down Roppongi's very crowded streets. You're supposed to ride on the sidewalks, I later learned, though I don't know how that's even possible. Traffic runs the wrong way over there, so heading straight into it, I picked the wrong way over there, so heading straight into it, I picked and wove my way between cars and vans, dodging pedestrians, trying to keep my 50-pound duffel bag on the handlebars, and not get dragged backward off the seat by the other bag hanging around my neck. Roppongi Crossing, though by no means Tokyo's largest or busiest intersection, is where thousands of teenagers meet before heading off to the bars and clubs. The streets were unbelievably dense with pedestrians, people hanging around, flashing neon, flapping banners, more screaming signs, pimpy-looking young men in suits and patent leather shoes, surrounded by dyed blonde Asian women in high boots and micro miniskirts. Felipe took a hard turn and we were heading down a hill. Through twisting, narrow, and decidedly quieter streets, things became stranger and even more unfamiliar. The smell of something good to eat issuing from every building we passed. The organization kept a few apartments in a kind of residential hotel. It looked like a hotel, felt like a hotel, but had no visible employees. It was comfortable, spacious by my imagined Tokyo standards, and equipped with cable TV, phone, fax, kitchenette, and ingeniously designed bathroom. I was soon unpacked in a green and agreeably installed my mysterious French boss staying next door. I'm sure you want to shower, maybe rest for a while, said Felipe before heading back to the hall. Can you find your way to the restaurant? I was pretty sure I could. After a long shower in the short, deep apartment bathtub, I managed to find my way back to the hall where I was shown around and introduced. Frederick Mardell was a chef from Aquitaine by way of Bora Bora. His chefs de partie, Hiroyoshi Baba of Japan, Delma Sumeda Alpitia of Sri Lanka, and Mokoko of Myanmar were gracious in the extreme. Fortunately, the common language in the kitchen was French, which I found to my surprise that I could still speak and understand. I had worried about this moment. I'd been apprehensive about invading another chef's kitchen. We tend to get our backups with the arrival of interlopers. Our backs up, and though it may have been nice to be held up as some sort of benchmarks for the how organization, I knew how I'd have felt if the chef from, say, the Washington or Miami branch came swanning into my kitchen wanting to show me how the big boys do it. Frederick was a friendly and gracious host. However, like the rest of the crew, I'd never been to New York. I was a curiosity as strange to them as they were to me. The kitchen was small and spotless, with dangerously low range hooks for a 6'4" guy like me. A great covered canal ran around the floor beneath each station, with a current of constantly flowing water washing away my detritus that might fall from cutting boards. Containers were all space-saving, square in shape, and the counters were low to the ground. I put on my whites, unwrapped my knives, and hung around the kitchen for a while, watching food go out, taking it all in, making small talk with the crew, aware of a persistent throbbing behind my eyes, an unpleasant constriction around my temples, a feeling that I was somehow not getting enough oxygen. Beat from the flight, I only stayed a few hours that night until at 10 p.m. Tokyo time. My brain thoroughly poached with jet lag, I slunk back to the apartment to collapse. I woke up at 5 a.m. hungry, put on a pullover, long-sleeve t-shirt, jeans, black elk-skin, cowboy boots that had seen better days, and a suit, cut leather jacket that Stephen had picked up used for me at a flea market. I was ready for adventure. Breakfast? At first I didn't have the nerve. I wandered Roppongi's early morning streets, tortured by the delicious smells emanating from the many businessmen's noodle shops. Intimidated by the crowds, Japanese salarymen sat cheek to jowl, happily slurping down bowls of soba. I didn't want to stare. I didn't want to offend. I was acutely aware of how freakish and un-Japanese I looked with my height in my boots and leather jacket. The prospect of pushing aside the banner to one of these places, sliding back the door and stepping inside and squeezing onto a stool at a packed counter and trying to figure out how and what to order was a little frightening. One couldn't enter a place, change one's mind, and then creep away. The prospect of being the center of attention at this tender hour, with the capillaries in my brain shriveled from all the beers on the flight, and the jet lag even worse than it had been the day before. I just couldn't handle it. I wandered the streets gaping, my stomach growling, looking for somewhere, anywhere to sit down and have coffee, something to eat. God help me, I settled for Starbucks. At least I saw from the street they allowed smoking. It was drizzling outside by now, and I was grateful for the refuge, if ashamed of myself. I sipped coffee when I ordered it. The counter help repeated the order to one another at ear-splitting volume. Tripa latte, aye, one tripa latte. I sat by the window, head pounding, smoking and sipping, summoning the courage for another pass at a soba joint. There was no way. I told myself that I was going to eat my first Tokyo meal in Starbucks. Pinned under the wheels of that hypothetical Mr. Softy truck, I would have something to regret. Muttering to myself, I charged out of Starbucks, found the narrowest, most uninviting-looking street, pushed aside the banner of the first soba shop I encountered, slid back the door, and plopped myself down on a stool. When greeted, I simply pointed a thumb at the guy next to me and said, "Dozo, I have what he's having." Things worked out well. I was soon slurping happily away at a big steaming bowl of noodles, pork, rice, and pickles. This method of ordering would become my modus operandi. M-O-D-U-S space O-P-E-R-A-N-D-I. Over the following days and nights, I can tell you that I felt a lot better about myself after my breakfast. I spent a few hours at the restaurant before hailing a cab for Chiyoda-ku district. I had an engagement. If you didn't already know, a few years back I wrote a satirical thriller, Policier, set predictably in the restaurant business, based loosely on my experience at Work Progress and with the Italian fraternal organization I mentioned earlier, was acquired for translation by the eminent Japanese publishing house Hayakawa. Being the hustler that I am, upon learning I was headed for Tokyo, I immediately contacted my Japanese publisher, volunteering a bit disingenuously to do anything I could to help promote the book over there. I don't know how nice or how welcome a thing to do it was. The book had been out for a while and clearly had not set the world on fire. David Hasselhoff might have hit it big over there. Airwolf reruns were once huge on the Pacific Rim, but my little book had not, I think, caused my publishers to send for me to satisfy public demand for a closer look. What a responsibility, I now realized, what a situation I had saddled Hayakawa with, giving them an alarming 1 week's notice of my arrival. However horrified they might privately have been, they responded with enormous tact and hospitality. An event was organized, a reception committee was formed, cards were laid on, lunches arranged, copies of my book were found and quickly displayed in the ground floor bookstore of their corporate offices. So I found myself headed off to the Chiyoda-ku district to meet the chef at La Riviere, a restaurant adjacent to and owned by my publisher. I was to cook a meal evocative of my earlier work of fiction for the benefit of the press, provide a few bonds mots at a press conference, appear on the Japanese cable TV network also owned by my publisher. In every way caused inconvenience to strangers who had been nothing but generous to me from afar. The chef of La Riviere, Suzuki-san, must have been thrilled to have me show up in his kitchen. Bad enough some big, hairy gaijin was getting rammed down his throat, making use of his staff, rummaging through his reach-ins, but I was cooking Italian. The menu for the event was minestra toscana, followed by a pelard of veal with roasted red pepper, coulis, and basil oil, and a salad of arugula, endive, and radicchio. Chef Suzuki was polite as I was ushered into his kitchen with the requisite bowing and greeting. He was helpful and polite in every way, as was his crew. But he must have been simmering with rage and disgust. Suzuki-san and I communicated through a translator and gestures, my gift of a Yankee and World Series champs baseball cap, going only a short way to ameliorating the chef's molar grinding disease for what I was about to do to his kitchen. My simple Italian lunch, recreating a home-cooked meal prepared by a gangster character in the book, must have looked to the chef like roadkill. And the portions, I thought I'd scale them down nicely, but after serving the meal to a room full of bowing, chain-smoking, and very genial Hayakawa executives and a few press-ganged members of the Fourth Estate, I found myself repeatedly asked, Bourdain-san, the portions I let how many grams of meat in each order? When I replied, the reaction was giggling and head shaking, an indication I came to believe of abject terror. The prospect of returning a partially eaten entree, of not finishing, is a terrifying one, and the proper Japanese will avoid causing such offense at all costs, so the thought of tucking into a 2.5-pound côte de boeuf or a full order of cassoulet to Lucine must have seemed to my host like scaling a mountain of dung. Still, the Hayakawa people were extremely kind. I was driven around by 2 senior editors, invited to lunch with Chef Suzuki cooking at this time. My second book was, I believe, rushed into print, and might otherwise have been forgotten had it not turned up on the doorstep. I got to see myself on Japanese TV in the press. I was shown how to use the subways by Hayakawa hosts. I experienced the not unpleasant occasion of having a whole room of the people bowing to me in near unison. I got to meet the elegant, shrewd, and impressive Mr. Hayakawa himself, and I signed a lot of books for persons no longer living. A first for me. Apparently this is not an unusual practice, a commemorative signed copy for the deceased. I wasn't doing too badly. By day 3, my head still felt as if someone was tightening a vice around it, and I probably offended many at Hayakawa with my inadvertently boorish behavior, but I had been out on my own and around town. I cooked not one but two I cooked in not one but 2 Japanese kitchens. I was comfortably taking cabs, ordering food and drink, using mass transit, and exploring at will. I was having a good time. I was learning. Back at Le How, I used my recent experience at La Riviere to scale down the portions and pretty up the presentations. Working with Frederick and his crew, I rearranged plates to resemble smaller versions of what we were doing in New York. Going more vertical, applying some new garnishes, and then observing customer reactions. I looked for and found ways to get more color contrast on the plates. Moved the salads out to separate receptacles. Stuck sprigs of herb here and there. With Frederick, I tried to develop a repertoire of specials, trying to make sense of the arcane system of supplies in Japan. Things were different here. What was ordered was not always what arrived. My inquiries about foodstuffs were often met with blank stares and shrugs. When the problem was finally identified, the answer was most often too expensive. The supply situation really was a problem. Onglet, hanger, côte de boeuf, rib section, and fowl filet, sirloin were all shipped from our central butchery in New York, so that was fine, but the bright red filet was Japanese product and widely expensive. Fish and produce were objects of religious sanctity, particularly fish, and the price reflected that. A gift of a melon in Japan implies a life of obligation. Frites are taken very seriously in our organization, but Japanese potatoes have an unusual starch sugar content and require blanching in water. I suggested peanut oil instead of canola like we use in New York, and was informed that one could rent a small apartment for what it costs to fill a deep fryer with it. I brought along some white truffle oil and some truffles, and the crew gazed at them like Martian artifacts. There was no runner or expediter at La Hao, Tokyo. After food was plated, it was hand-carried to the outer service bar where it was picked up by the waiters. The guard manager, who also doubled as pâtissier and worked in an open area visible to the dining room, was required out of custom to shriek welcome in Japanese along with waiters, bartender, and manager to all arriving guests. This was somewhat alarming to a jet-lagged newcomer like myself. The process was repeated on departure as it was almost everywhere I went, the ubiquitous scream of arigato gozaimashita, making me want to leap out of my skin. Frederick was beat. He worked 7 days a week, 14 plus hours a day, as did the general manager. It was early days for our new outpost, not yet busy enough to require full staff. A total commitment was required. The GM's eyes seemed to float around in his skull in pools of fatigue. The cooks worked split shifts, arriving at the last possible second before service, working through lunch, then they were cut loose to wander idly around Roppongi, far from the residences, before returning for dinner. The carping and grumbling an arrangement like this would inspire back in New York would lead invariably to mutiny and open revolt. Here, people went about their tasks with considerable good cheer and dedication. The proletarian chic of La Hao, New York, was something new to the Japanese. You don't really get the humble working man's fare. They adore the higher end stuff, though, and there were unintentionally hilarious recreations of hot and nouvelle classics, fettuccine and rice on the same plate, for instance. There was in his a heartful desire to learn about French cuisine, to enjoy it. Though business has picked up enormously since my trip, at the time I was there eating at La Hao, with its Flintstone-sized portions and funky attitude about blood, fat, and organ meat, it was still a bold adventure, so I suspected it was just a matter of time. An unusual number of single women would show up for lunch, sitting alone and looking shiftily, even guiltily about, before tucking into their steaks and nibbling their frites. The female office workers looked pleasantly secretive about their brassiere encounters, as if they were involved in some deliciously dirty and forbidden conspiracy. Like meeting a lover, watching a group of Japanese salarymen tear into a Côte de Boeuf for two, I got the impression of a kind of gleeful social disobedience and almost revolutionary act of convention breaking. It was my first experience of the proper Japanese cutting loose, I would see more. So they were eating too much. I went out exploring all the time by now. The jet lag wouldn't let me sleep, so I crashed late and rose early, plunging blindly down dark streets at all hours. There is apparently no street crime in Tokyo. The most menacing-looking bunch of Alvis-coped pimps and touts would move aside wordlessly on my approach, gaining on a group of leather-jacketed punks with silver hair and motorcycle jackets from behind. One of them would detect me and make an almost imperceptible sound, a cough or a clearing of the throat, meaning apparently gaijin coming through, and the crowd would part to make way. No one would meet my eye with a direct gaze, whether standing outside a whorehouse at 4 in the morning or examining their pinky rings by an idling Yakuza limo. No one ever said, "What are you looking at?" as might have been the case in American cities under similar circumstances. No one would meet my eye with a direct gaze, whether outside a whorehouse at 4 in the morning or examining the pinky rings. Barkers for hostess bars and strip clubs and whorehouses. Even the ones that accepted Westerners never solicited me directly. I passed through them like a ghost. I walked and walked, streets full, streets empty, day and night, aimlessly, in wide concentric circles, using a visible landmark to navigate around. I took subways to stops where I had no idea where I was and walked more. I ate sushi, I slurped soba's noodles, I ate food off conveyor belt buffets where every imaginable dish rolled by and one simply grabbed what one wanted. I entered bars populated by only Japanese, bars for expatriates and women who loved them. Booze was affordable and there was no tipping anywhere. I was the quiet American, the ugly American, the hungry ghost, searching and searching for whatever came next. One night at La Hao, Felipe invited me out for what turned out to be the most incredible meal of my life. He'd seen me by now how I was digging Tokyo. He knew from my arrival and departure times about my nocturnal wanderings, so I guess he figured I was ready. He grinned mischievously all the way. As usual, I had no idea where we were going. Felipe led me across Roppongi, crossing to the skankier, glitzier side where the streets were choked with touts and barkers, whores and shills, video arcades, hostess bars, and love hotels. We passed by poodle-cut pimpy boys in the heavily made-up Thai, Filipina, and Malaysian women in their platform boots and crotch-high dresses, past enormous and eerily empty Yakuza-run nightclubs, karaoke bars, restaurants. It became darker as we walked farther and farther from the neon and screaming video signs, yet still not a rude comment or hostile stare. Finally, Felipe stopped, sniffed the air like a honey dog, turned suddenly, and headed toward a dimly lit stairwell in a deserted courtyard, a single pictogram of a leaping fish, the only indicator of activity below. Down a flight of steps, not a sound, to a bare sliding door. He pushed it aside, and we were standing in a small, well-lit sushi bar. 3 young sushi chefs in headbands and 2 older men in chef's coats manned an unfinished blonde wood bar packed with somewhat inebriated-looking businessmen and their dates. We were ushered to the only 2 open seats directly in front of a slowly melting monolith of carved ice surrounded by fish and shellfish so fresh, so good-looking, it took my breath away. My chef friends in New York would have gouged an eye out or given up 5 years of their lives for the meal I was about to have. First, hot towels and the condiments, freshly grated wasabi, some dipping sauce. We were brought frozen sake, thick, cloudy, utterly delicious. The first sip seemed to worm its way directly into my brain like an intoxicating ice cream headache. Had many more sips, Felipe all too anxious to pour more and more. The first tiny plate, tentacles of baby octopus, arrived, the chef standing there while we ate, examining our reactions, which were of course moans, smiles, bows of appreciation and thanks. Already feeling for filling the sake, we thanked him in French, English, and bad Japanese, covering all bases. More bows. The chef removed the plates. His hands moved a few motions with the knife, and we were presented with the internal parts of a giant clam, still pulsating with life as it died slowly on our plates. Again, the chef watched as we ate. And again, we were a good audience, closing our eyes, transported. Next came abalone with what might have been the roe and the liver of something. Who cared? It was good. More sake. Snapper came next, then bass, then mackerel, fresh and squeaky and lovely to look at. We went on calling for more, our appetites beginning to attract notice from the other chefs and some of the customers who never had seen anyone, especially Westerners, with our kind of appetites. Each time the chef put another item down in front of us, I detected almost a dare, as if he didn't expect us to like what he was giving us, as if any time now he'd find something too much for our barbarian tastes and crude, unsophisticated palates. No way, we went on, calling for more and more. Felipe telling the chef in halting Japanese that we were ready for anything he had. We wanted his choice. Give us your best shot, motherfucker. Though I'm sure he phrased it more elegantly. The other customers began to melt away, and our host, the chef, joined by an assistant, now seemed impressed with our zeal. The blissed out looks on our faces, our endless capacity for more and more and more. Another clam arrived. This one tiny, more rose, some baby flounder. It kept coming, accompanied by pickled wasabi stem. Seaweed so fresh I could taste deep ocean water. Another tiny moist towel was provided in a little basket, and Felipe informed me that custom allowed us to eat with our hands at this point in the meal. Tuna arrived from the belly, from the loin. We kept grinning, kept bowing, kept eating. Our sakes were refilled, the chef openly smiling now. These crazy Gaijin wanted it all, baby. The best course yet arrived, a quickly grilled half fish head. The chef watches, curious, I imagine, to see how we deal with this new development. It was unbelievable. Every crevice, every scrap of this sweet, delicate Dorado or Chilean pompano. I didn't know from looking at the party-charred face, and by now I didn't much care. Had responded differently to the heat of the grill, from the fully cooked remnant of body behind the head to the crispy skin and cartilage, the tender, translucently red cheeks. It was a mosaic of distinct flavors and textures in the eye. Oh yeah, we dug out the orbs, slurped down the gelatinous matter behind it. Deep in the socket, we gnawed the eyeball down to a hard white core. When we were done with the collage of good stuff, when we'd fully picked over every tiny flake and scrap, there was nothing left but the teeth and few bones. We were finished, no way. More sashimi, more sushi, some tiger shrimp, what looked like herring, so fresh it crunched. I didn't care what they put in front of me anymore. I trusted the smiling chef and his crew. I was going along for the full ride. More frozen sake, more food. The last few customers got up and lurched to the door, like us, red-faced and perspiring from the booze. We continued. There had to be something we hadn't tried yet. I was beginning to think that some of the cooks were calling their homes by now, telling their families, get in here, get a load of these Cajuns. They're eating everything in the store. After course 20 or so, the chef slit, brushed, dabbed, and formed the final course, a piece of raw sea eel. Earthenware cups of green tea were delivered. Finally, we were done. We left to the usual bows and screams of arigato, gosamashita, and picked our way carefully, very carefully, up the stairs back to the physical world. I left Felipe at La Hall, had a couple of cocktails at an empty, foul Irish pub, and staggered back to my apartment. Had to get up early for the fish market. Tsukiji, Tokyo's central fish market, puts New York's Fulton Street to shame. It's bigger, better, and unlike its counterpart in Manhattan, a destination worth visiting if only to gape. I arrived by taxi at 4:30 in the morning. The colors of the market alone seemed to burn my retinas. The variety, the strangeness, the sheer volume of seafood available at Tsukiji amounted to a colossal terror dome of mind-boggling dimensions. The simple awareness that the seafood-crazy Japanese were raking, dredging, netting, and hooking that much stuff out of the sea each day gave me pause. A Himalayan-sized mountain of discarded styrofoam fish boxes greeted my arrival. Styrofoam fish boxes, okay, as well as the surrounding rabbit warren of shops. Breakfast joints and merchants servicing the market. The market itself was enclosed, stretching seemingly into infinity under a hangar-type roof, and I will tell you that my life as a chef will never be the same again after spending the morning and subsequent mornings there. Scallops and snowshoe-sized black shells lay atop crushed ice. Fish, still flopping, twitching, and struggling in pans of water, spat at me as I walked down the first of many narrow corridors between the vendor stands. Things were different here in that the Japanese market workers had no compunction about looking you in the eye, even nudging you out of the way. They were busy, space was limited, and moving product around in between sellers, buyers, dangerously careening forklifts, gawking tourists, and about 1 million tons of seafood was tough. The scene was riotous. Eels pinned to boards by a spike through the head were filleted alive. Workers cut loins of tuna off the bone in two-man teams, lopping off perfect hunks with truly terrifying-looking swords and saws that, mishandled, could easily have halved their lopping off perfect hunks with truly terrifying-looking swords and saws that, mishandled, could easily have halved their partners. Periwinkles, cockles, encyclopedic selections of roes, salted, pickled, cured, and fresh were everywhere. Fish still bent from rigor mortis, porgy, sardines, swordfish, abalone, spiny lobsters, giant lobsters, blowfish, bonito, bluefin, yellowfin. Tuna was sold like gems, displayed in light boxes and illuminated from below like little labels indicating grade and price. Tuna was king. There was fresh, dried cut number 1, number 2 vendors who specialized in the less lovely bits. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of gigantic bluefin and bonito, blast frozen on faraway factory ships. Frost-covered 200 to 300 pounders were stacked everywhere, like stone figures on Easter Island, a single slice taken from near the tail so that quality could be examined. They were laid out in rows, built up in heaps, sawed into redwood-like sections, still froze, hauled about on forklifts. There were sea urchins, egg sacs, fish from all over the world. Giant squid as long as an arm and baby squid the size of a thumbnail shared space with white bait, smelts, what looked like worms, slugs, snails, crabs, mussels, shrimp, and everything else that grew. Swam, skittered, clawed, crawled, snaked, or clung near the ocean floor. Unlike the low-tide reek of Fulton, Tsukiji smelled hardly at all. The low-tide reek. Yeah, the low-tide reek is disgusting. Unlike the low-tide reek of Fulton, that's the market, Tashiki smelled hardly at all. What scent it had was not of fish, but of seawater and the cigarettes of the fishmongers. I had never seen or even imagined many of the creatures I saw. Hungry, I pushed into a nearby stall, the Japanese version of Rosie's Diner. A place packed with rubber-booted market workers eating breakfast. The signs were entirely in Japanese with no helpful pictures, but a friendly fishmonger took charge. What arrived was, of course, flawless. Here I was in the Tokyo version of a greasy spoon, surrounded by a mob of tough-looking bastards in dripping boots and the requisite New York-style rude waitress. And the food was on a par with the best of my hometown. Fresh, clean, beautifully, simply presented. Soon I was wolfing down sushi, miso soup, and tail section of braised fish and sauce, and an impressive array of pickles, beets 2 eggs over. I loaded up with cockles and squid for the restaurant, bought some knives from my sous chef back in New York, and head aching, stopped off at a Akatsuki temple where the alien apparently wafted incense smoker over the afflicted parts. The smoke did nothing for my head. I bought aspirin, which incongruously came with a free candy and pamphlets advertising patent medicines, and took a taxi to Kababashi, Tokyo's Bowery. Tokyo's Bowery. I guess Bowery's cooks know what it is, I guess. It was a perfect metaphor for Tokyo, ringing up some wine glasses, cocktail shakers, tablecloth clips, and cake molds. The clerk at the restaurant supply store added up my bill on an abacus, but computed the tax on a calculator. I was really beginning to worry about my head when I finally bumped into Felipe again at the restaurant. Can this still be jet lag, I asked, and the pain seemed to be aspirin-proof. Am I dying? Oh, you mean the helmet, he asked, circling his own head with his fingers to indicate the exact location of the pain. He shrugged. Si es normal. It's never a good thing when a Frenchman says sieste normal. I knew he'd been up early too. I heard him knocking around his room as I left for the fish market. Here was 7 at night. As usual, I was starting to fade, my English degenerating into monosyllables, experiencing hot flashes, sweats, and chills. I asked Felipe hopefully if he had a nap since the morning. He looked so damn fresh, crisp, and debonair in a smartly cut suit, positively rosy-cheeked and in the middle of some Byzantine accounting and scheduling problem that would have caused me difficulty when my faculties were at their peak. Oh no, he said cheerfully, when I'm in Tokyo, I don't sleep much. I just take my vitamins and go. The following night was my last in Tokyo. Felipe took me out to a shabu joint in Shibuya, Tokyo's Times Square. It was Friday night, and all the painstakingly observed customs and practices of the workday went out the window. The streets were packed with herds of insanely drunk businessmen and teenagers. In Tokyo, it's apparently okay, even de rigueur, to go out with the boss and the boys from the office and get completely stuttering, out of control drunk. In such circumstances, after a night of drinking and karaoke, it's okay to vomit on your boss's shoes, take a swing at him, call him an asshole. I'd probably throw you over his shoulder and carry you home. Everybody was drunk. Everywhere, lovely young women brushed the hair out of their violently heavy boyfriends' faces as they leaned on all fours in the gutters. Suit and tied salarymen projectile vomited, lurched, sang, caroused, and staggered like bumper cars down the humanity-clogged streets. Mobs of people searched in never-ending waves toward Shibuya Station to meet friends and lovers by the statue of a dog. The dog, it was explained to me, had continued to show up every day at the station long after its master had died. That kind of dedication impresses the Japanese, and a statue was erected in the pooch's honor. It was one of the most popular meeting places in the city. Nearby, the narrow, neon-lit streets swam with more nightclubs, bars, restaurants, screaming building-high video screens whose exhortations made my molars shake like tuning forks. We found a shabu joint, a crowded tatami room where there were no other Westerners, and managed to contort our limbs under and around the low table. A big wok, W-O-K, filled with broth was heated up for us. Wok, W-O-K, filled with broth here, and a uniformed attendant arrived with an Everest-high heap of meat, vegetables, seafood, and noodles. We kicked off the meal with hot sake, heated with grilled fish bones. The fish oil that collected on top was ignited before drinking, and the flavor was heavily aromatic with fumes that seemed to penetrate brain tissue immediately. Item by item, according to cooking time, the food was added to the oil, like a giant fondue. When everything had been deposited into the wok, we were left to our own devices, save frequent refills of chilled sake. I did not want to leave. I had only begun to eat. There were a million restaurants, bars, temples, back alleys, nightclubs, neighborhoods, and markets to explore. Fully feeling the effects of the sake, I was seriously considering burning my passport, trading my jeans and leather jacket for a dirty seersucker suit, and disappearing into the exotic East. This was excitement, romance, adventure. There was so much more of it, too much more of it, for even another month, another year, another decade to adequately contain my investigations. I knew I could live here now. I learned a few things, not much, but enough to negotiate traffic, feed myself, get drunk, get around town. I picture myself as a character like Green's Scobie in Africa, or the narrator of The Quiet American in Saigon. Even Kurt's in the Heart of Darkness, my head swimming with all sorts of romantically squalid notions. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the streets still swarming with young Japanese and American sports cars, girls sitting on the back of convertibles, gangsters and whores emerging from nightclubs. Moving on to the next place, shirtless Gaijins howling at the moon from upstairs whorehouses. I staggered down dark back streets, hit some more bars, and finding myself incongruously hungry again, and wanting to soak up some of the sea of alcohol in my stomach, committed the ultimate in Tokyo faux pas, F-A-U-X, space P-A-S, faux pas. I ate at McDonald's hamburger while I walked. The train shut down at 11:30, and most of Tokyo, it seemed, preferred to stay out all night to take a taxi. One could, Felipe had explained before leaving me off at Roppongi crossing, borrow money to get home from almost any policeman, if drunk and unexpectedly short of funds. The idea of not returning the next day to pay the debt was, in typically Japanese thinking, unthinkable. Also, you gotta pay the guy. The idea of not returning the next day to repay the debt was, in typically Japanese thinking, unthinkable. I walked unsteadily for hours, stopped off for a final drink, managed somehow to get back to my apartment and call Nancy. She laid on some fresh Bialis from Columbia bagels and some Krispy Kreme donuts for my return. She laid on some fresh Bialis, B-I-A-L-Y-S, from Columbia bagels. She laid on and some Krispy Kreme donuts for my return. So she's gonna have that from. What does this make me think right here? Okay, those books. So The Quiet American in Saigon. I want to read Green Scobie in Africa. I'm gonna write those books down. Anyway, y'all, peace.